Hey everybody, it's Erik Torenberg, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Village Global's Venture Stories. I'm here today joined by very special returning guest, Ben Reinhardt. Ben, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Erik. It's great to be here.
So, Ben, you are a research fellow at the Astera Institute and creator of PARPA, private ARPA, which we'll get into the episode. And you wrote this really fantastic piece the other month, Shifting the Impossible to the Inevitable, a private ARPA user manual. Why don't you talk about the inspiration for this piece and what led to you writing it?
So the inspiration for the piece, very high level, was frustration with the fact that the current institutional structures that we depend on to sort of make there be more awesome sci-fi stuff in the world felt inadequate at doing their job. It felt like there's a real gap there. So I started digging into that and started digging into how DARPA works and sort of realized that, or at least came up with the hypothesis that it might be possible to replicate the DARPA model in a private setting. And so that was really the inspiration, was like, okay, it might be possible to riff on the DARPA model. And if so, how would you do that? And so the entire piece basically fell out of that as a giant memo to myself. And the sort of intention of it was both to lay out very clearly what I'm trying to do with actually building PARPA as an institution, but then also hopefully lay down a lot of more general ideas that other people can pick up and run with as well.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited for this episode is because this audience is among others, a venture audience. And so they understand how startups are created, how they're legally structured, how they're funded, how they make money, different business models. But they may not be as familiar with, they might ask, hey, why do we not have crazy sci-fi shit in the world, given we have this venture model and listeners are very familiar with it? How would you sort of, before getting into some details of the piece, how would you sort of say, hey, what's incomplete about this model, and on either the legal structure side or the funding side or commercialization side, or maybe we can take them one by one if it's easier.
Totally. So, like, for the record, I think that venture capital and like high growth startups are like really great at a certain class of activity, and like really sort of like bringing things to market and bringing them up to scale. The trick is just that like there's a set of incentives that make it so that there's like a sort of a class of work that is hard for startups to do and hard for venture capital to fund. And that's work with like very high uncertainty around the technology in the market. So you think about it from a venture capital standpoint, and it's like you have a fund and you need to return like a pretty large amount to your investors, and you're sort of like competing with like many other asset classes on returns. And so the sorts of things that venture capital needs to invest in are things that can create like massive returns on fairly on like 10-year timescales. And like 10 years is a very long time in some domains. Like 10 years, like in software, 10 years is a really long time. But then in terms of like really developing new physical technology, it's actually quite short. Like if you look at the time scale of, say, developing the transistor, we're talking about like 15 years between really like kicking off the project and even having a like terrible first prototype. And so there's just like this, the timescales sort of like keep dragging on. And so that's sort of like one class of things that it's hard for venture to go after. And then also, like, quite frankly, there's a lot of work where it's hard to capture the value that it creates. And so, like, again, like, it has to do with return on investment. Is like, again, like, there's a lot of, like, in sort of like research, a lot of the value gets created by like people sort of like figuring out like the correct point in design space, which is actually like very hard. And then sort of like that knowledge, it makes it very easy for other people to take and run with. So, like, in venture, we talk about moats all the time. And like, very often, figuring out a point in design space has zero moat. And so, it might take you like 10 years of like fairly expensive research to get to that point. But once you get to that point, then everybody can sort of be like, oh yeah, like that's the right thing to run with. And then they go for that. And at that point, it makes sense to start investable companies. So that's, so I would say, like, just like hard to capture value and long, uncertain research work are sort of like the two classes of things that venture capital is just not well equipped to go after.
You mentioned before we were talking the need for non-academic. Let's bring in other sort of organization structures too, right? Academia, corporate. When you talk about what is each's role in sort of the comprehensive innovation ecosystem?
So academia is really good at sort of coming up with generalized principles and really going deep. Like, so academia is optimized for novelty, which is really great for like coming up with new ideas and approaches, and sort of like really like not blindly, but like wandering around in the woods. It's optimized for projects that can be done by maybe like 2 or 3 people. And so it's very good at those sort of things, but it sort of runs into limits when you need sort of larger coordinated efforts. And also in academia, you don't get very rewarded for like good designs once the principle has been demonstrated. So that's sort of the niche that academia fills. Corporate labs struggle a lot in the modern world because at the end of the day, they really only get full support when they're doing work that supports the core product of the corporation they're working for. And they also sort of, in order to get that support, they really need to be part of an organization that's sort of pulling in monopoly rents. So I think that like Google DeepMind is a great example of a very healthy corporate lab because you can make this argument that they're really doing work that supports Google's sort of core product of search and computer related things. Whereas, and Google sort of like has a monopoly, but like the fact of the matter is that there really aren't a lot of large companies that make sort of like physical products that are pulling in monopoly rents anymore. So corporate labs are sort of struggling. And then you have startups, which are really good at scaling things that sort of like quote unquote work already and growing very fast. And then you also have like government labs that work on things that are useful for the government, but there's a lot of problems with that. And then there's sort of like a long tail of other institutions.
And so you start the piece by talking about the niche that industrial labs used to fill in the ecosystem, and then talk about why they no longer fill that niche. Why don't you unpack that?
Yeah. So industrial labs, sort of like the paragon of that being Bell Labs, but also GE Labs, like DuPont, and others used to fill this role in the ecosystem where they brought together people with sort of very academic mindsets, but at the same time also had like large engineering teams and were tightly hooked into the entire sort of like manufacturing pipeline as well. to sort of do what Arthur Probjanker termed solutions R&D, where it's still very much research, but it's targeted at creating something very useful and long term. And so the corporate labs used to really sort of fill this gap. People would sort of jump back and forth between academia and corporate labs, and they sort of gave us everything from like amazing plastics to the transistor, and modern computing. And over time, sort of like, it's like we look at increasing competition as a really good thing. And I think for the most part it is, but what it has done is it's sort of like squeezed corporate labs so that they no longer sort of have the slack to sort of do these like big exploratory programs.
Totally. So say more about how we can better fill that niche.
I have a hypothesis that we might be able to fill that niche with organizations that are riffing on the DARPA model. And that's sort of the hypothesis that I'm pursuing. But I think that what we really need to do to go after that niche is try lots of different things, frankly. So it's like, I don't propose to have like the solution, but very broadly, I think what we need to do is figure out ways to create alternatives to academia where people can pursue research. We need to start thinking about funding research as philanthropy very seriously. And we need to think about just like sort of like alternative career paths for people who really want to build technology. Like right now, they can sort of go into academia, or they can go into a startup, and in some small cases, they can go work for corporate labs if they like have a CS degree.
I'm curious on the value capture side of things. One, do we think that's a big bottleneck that much more people would be going into it if they could make a lot more money off it? And then two, there's one idea I heard, I can't remember from who, that of sort of like a retroactive X Prize. Like you look, the people who made the transistor obviously created a ton of value. Inventions like that don't always capture the value, or don't often capture the value that their, technology enables. And so is there a way where you could sort of give this enormous, cash prize retroactively to people who create these, game-changing, as you mentioned, design space innovations? And could that serve as a, forward-looking inspiration for people? Like, oh, if I create something really meaningful, maybe, I'll get this, $100 million or $1 billion, whatever, prize. What are your thoughts?
So I don't claim to speak for everybody, but I think that the value capture problem is actually less for the people doing the work and much more for the people funding the work. I've talked to enough people, and like I'm one of them, where as long as we can like pay the bills and sort of like have a sense that like, we'll not die in the gutter. I'm not like, there's lots of people who are not actually out to get rich. The trick is where do our salaries come from? And like, where's the money to like buy equipment come from? Right? like research is really expensive because you need to get all these like bespoke machines and buy consumables and like rent lab space and all that good stuff. So it's like, where does that money come from? And so the value capture, I think, is much more a question for the people who are funding that work, more so than the people who are doing the work. So I would say like, yes, it's very much an issue there. I think that like a robust prize system absolutely could, like, is one potential solution. There's people who have thought much more about this than I have, but you could imagine almost like if you had a robust prize system, you could like take out loans based on the prize, and so like the banks would underwrite the work to do the prizes. I'm not sure that it completely solves the problem, only insofar as like I sort of like to say that we stand on the shoulders of too many giants to count. in the sense that like we like to think that we can sort of like assign, we can say like, oh, like this basically assign responsibility for an innovation. But at the end of the day, like as soon as you start like digging into who's responsible for anything, there's like this like cascade of people and organizations. And so it's like, I don't like, maybe someone smarter than me can figure out a way of like really assigning credit, but there's just like so much illegible stuff that goes on. You know, it's like barroom conversations, or like this person talking to their neighbor over the hedge, that I don't think that retroactive prizes would completely solve it, but it would definitely be a step in the right direction.
What are other bottlenecks that you see that we haven't yet covered?
I think like, so I touched on it very briefly, but there's, I think a big thing about it, a big bottleneck is sort of what Michael Nielsen calls like shadows of the future, where I think like we sort of tend to ignore like the very human aspect of people's motivations, where it's like a lot of people want to have like family and kids and sort of like a life one day. And if you sort of like can't see what your career trajectory will look like, it makes it very hard to do that. And so we don't, even like I fall into this trap where we propose sort of like ways to fund people and projects for some amount of time. But the thing that sort of academia offers is like an entire career trajectory. So like somehow we need the ecosystem to like offer alternative career paths, not just sort of like career waypoints. That's one bottleneck. I think a big bottleneck is also just like in the way that people think about philanthropy, in the sense that there's this with research, there's this really uncomfortable thing where it's like you can't, it really needs to be able to like wander and take as long as it needs and maybe not produce anything. And that's like very unsatisfying for people, like that it sort of does feel like wasting money. So it's like somehow we need to like change like how we're thinking about philanthropy away from this. I feel like there's a lot of attitude of like you're buying a product, and your like reputation is staked on this product. The idea that I really like is like thinking about it almost like technological tithing. So there used to be a concept in like most major religions in the world that you give like something like 10% of your income to like the poor and the needy. And so one idea I like to play around with is this idea that like for people who have made their money based on someone in the past doing work to build technology, maybe what we should do is like all of us just do that 10% tithing to someone who's like trying to just build technology, so that in the future there can be someone else, and pay that forward. Another bottleneck is just like how people think about how ideas become reality. I think like I think like the sort of thinking about this like pipeline where you go from like basic research to applied research to commercialization. I think that conception itself is a bottleneck. And like we need to think about it as like there's a whole bunch of activities that need to happen in the world, and like ideas kind of hop around between them.
Cool. Well, let's shift into the private ARPA proposal. Why don't you sort of lay out some of the tenets of what that could look like?
So the core of the DARPA model in my mind is the idea of like the empowered program manager. And basically the idea is that you have someone who's very technical and really sort of has a vision for what the program could be. And they're effectively like a CEO, but not of a company. And you say, and you say like, okay, go make it happen. And that person then goes and coordinates a number of different research projects across different organizations, sort of towards a concrete goal. And so this is important and different from sort of a startup or a corporate lab, because what it allows you to do is pursue parallel paths towards the same goal, which can be very important when you don't know sort of which part of design space in the technology is going to be important. And I think the sort of last piece that I think is really important is this idea of program design, which I meant to mention around it as a bottleneck, which is that I think sort of as a society, we've actually gotten worse at technological planning, because it's like this muscle that software has caused us to not need to use, right? So like, if you look, I love this this like 1976 fusion plan that the US government created. And like they actually planned out to from 1976 all the way out to 2006 in like a reasonable amount of detail. And I think that we've, now that sounds ridiculous because everything is like supposed to be iterative and fast. So I think the idea that we can actually like design these programs upfront and sort of really think through what work needs to be done and what our hypotheses are is the last piece of the model that I think is defining.
And just to unpack some of the points in the piece, you talk about, well, you talk about the difference between Bell Labs and DARPA and why DARPA is a better sort of role model for this than Bell Labs. Why don't you say a bit more about that?
Yeah. So like Bell Labs was great, right? And if I could get or anybody could get $5 billion a year right now in perpetuity, they should definitely go start a Bell Labs. But I think that in the Bell Labs, in order to be what it was, it required three conditions that only a few organizations meet today. And those are that it was supported by a company that was getting monopoly profits. It was doing work that was tied to their core product, or at least answering an existential threat for them. There was a certain set of conditions that needed to be met, that the only companies that meet that today are basically software companies. So if we want to see good solutions R&D being done sort of outside of pure software, or like very related things, then any organization that we would create to try to emulate Bell Labs would not be able to meet those conditions. And so I think it would be probably likely to fail.
So what are other things a private DARPA, being outside of the scope of government, has to rethink or consider or figure out?
Yeah, I mean, like a big piece is money. DARPA just gets a budget from Congress every year, and that's pretty straightforward. I've been like one of the biggest questions that I'm still struggling with is like, how do we pay for this thing? Because if we could confidently say like, hey, this will like turn a profit, then it would be a good for-profit company, and you raise investment and off to the races. But I think it's like much more, and like there are investors who are like very patient, and so like if the ROI would be high enough, then we could do that. But like I can't say with confidence that it will pay for itself. And if you actually run the numbers, I would make the argument that DARPA could not pay for itself. So the thing to figure out is like, how do you like get the money between philanthropy and possibly having sort of like a for-profit arm that just allows investors to invest in the things that we think could make money. So that's a big piece. There's also questions around the legal structure, right? To support both the funding piece, and then also thinking about sort of incentivizing the program managers and the people who would work with us. Because as I noted, we're asking people to temporarily do this thing that's like pretty high uncertainty and does not necessarily lead to a long-term career, right? And so it's like, how do you make that worthwhile for people? And a part of the answer might be that you give them options in any upside, and then also let them really have a say in how the organization is run. So a large part of the legal structure that we're looking at involves putting a lot of organizational decision-making power in the hands of the program managers, and so you can sort of think of it as a almost like a research collective to some extent. So those are the two major pieces, and then on top of that, there's just like reputational bootstrapping. DARPA has a very long track record of being an organization that people want to work with, and they have like a lot of prestige, and so we need to think about, okay, like how do we bootstrap that reputation so that amazing people will want to come work with us.
Totally. What are other things that you have the biggest questions about that weren't yet figured out on this in this write-up?
Oh man. Well, again, I think the funding is still a big open question. We're like so let's see. On top of the funding and the legal structure, which I'm still working on, I think a big open question is it possible to sort of like narrow down what we're working on, right? Like it's I left it very ambiguous because I partially didn't know. I've refined that hypothesis a little bit. Something that I'm playing with, which is that the idea that like new materials and manufacturing processes are kind of the bedrock of civilization, and also they happen to be the work to create them sort of falls into this zone of doesn't fit into an academic lab and doesn't fit into a startup. So that's one thing. I think another big question is just like what is the incentive for people to come like be a program manager instead of going off and starting a company or staying in an academic lab. I think those, and then I guess another question, that open question that I have that you probably have many more insights on, is like how do you sort of build a community around this thing? Because I think that it's probably going to be very important to have people sort of adjacent to the organization that can sort of like bubble up ideas for new programs, people who are potentially good program managers, because of the temporary nature of the role. We're sort of going to need to constantly be on the lookout for that. Yeah. And I guess the other questions is like, where does it have its gaps? Because like any organization is going to have constraints, and so like obviously like even in my wildest dreams, there will be sort of activities that PARPA won't be able to address, and so it's like questions around like sort of how do we support more like sort of like really exploratory research of the like you just need to like support someone to go like piddle around for 10 years, right? And how do we support that is still a completely open question in my mind.
Yeah, it's really interesting on sort of the community building or movement building. Like there are organizations and people who are, you have to be good at both like drumming up interest and then also like creating structure for people to contribute. And so like, for example, like I think a lot of people think that Pioneer is cool, like Daniel Gross's effort. I think a lot of people think that Laura Deming's longevity fund is awesome. And I think so they've done an amazing job at drumming up interest, and they're like laser focused on their business, which is great. But I wonder if there's like some value that's being left on the table in terms of people like with capital, with talent, with expertise in like adjacent areas, that there's so much interest that maybe they should be creating more structures to harness all that interest.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like I have no good answers to like how do you actually do that.
Yeah.
So that I think that's probably like on Deck's job.
Yeah, but you inspired just that new sort of like breakdown, because I hadn't thought about that you need to do both, and that they're two separate things in some sense. Yeah, this is all really interesting. I want to go back to some of the stuff that you mentioned in the piece, particularly around legal structures. You talk about entrepreneur first and YC having sort of these hybrid structures in a sense, hybrid venture upco model. What do you think that looks like here?
For PARPA?
Yeah.
So
what does the hybrid approach look like?
So, like, very concretely, the way that I'm structuring it is that there's a nonprofit entity and a for-profit entity, and they're separate. But the for-profit owns sort of like special controlling shares in the for-profit entity, and then and all of the work, like the research work, happens in the context of the nonprofit, with the hope that shifts incentives towards like creating amazing technology more so than creating profitable technology. But then every once in a while, something that is like actually makes sense as a company, like every once in a while, like there's a technology and it's like, oh, okay, like the best way to get this into the world will actually be a company. And in that situation, we'll license the technology to the for-profit, and the for-profit will spin it out. And then with the intention that one, that will hopefully make the entire organization more self-sustaining, right? Like if we can create an entire new industry, like a company that creates a new industry, it will definitely make the organizational longevity go up. And then also it will sort of give people who are uncomfortable just like donating money directly, but are okay with like very long-term, very high chance of zero return investments, a way to support the organization. And then finally, it will hopefully incentivize program managers by saying like, hey, you have some stake in the outcome here. So like, even if you yourself aren't working on something that is going to turn into a company, if someone does, then you get a stake in the upside. So those are sort of, and then I guess the last sort of like weird thing about the legal structure is that everybody who is a program manager has sort of like a vote in what the nonprofit does. And so again, it's like, I sort of actually was looking a little bit at like universities and how they like manage to have this like they managed to maintain a very consistent culture for hundreds of years in some cases. And I think it's because people who go there like really feel a lot of stake and ownership. And so I was trying to like replicate that with the legal structure.
Wow, that's really interesting. Yeah, I love that sort of potential joint ownership model.
Yeah. Well, again, this is all hypothesis. So, and I guess like sort of a meta thing that I'm trying to go for with this whole thing is to like do a bunch of institutional experiments and document them very well, so that hopefully even if we don't succeed, other people can learn from it, right? So it's like I sort of see this whole thing as a meta experiment, where it's like, okay, like here's the hypothesis, we're gonna like actually do the thing and like build the legal structure, and then we'll like continue to like put out reports on how it's going.
What does success look like here in terms of not just, well, yeah, for PARPA in general, but also in terms of like you mentioned, you want to see a bunch of different experiments, like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, this paper has the biggest success it could possibly have. What world does that look like? What happens?
So the biggest success that it could possibly have is like, one, PARPA is thriving as an organization, but two, a bunch of other people have created like other things, so like just other organizations that support new ways of creating science and technology. So like it's like you have examples like FROs. So you like see a bunch of those. You might see like some organization that just like gives someone like basically like endows people. Like you could imagine like someone going and endowing people, and just or like you can imagine an organization that is like really trying to create a like pre-commitment or like a market pre-commitment or like prize ecosystem, and just like generally having people trying more institutional experiments, right? Like in the same way that I think like I would say that like Paul Graham has won in the sense that like startups are now a thing, right? Like where when Y Combinator was starting, like people did startups, but it wasn't like there wasn't a whole like culture and like normalization around it. It was still like really weird. I'd love to see that happen, but for like institutional experiments. I think like that would be the wildest success. And then like ultimately like that actually leading to outcomes, right? Like where it's like I want us to be able to like fly our airships over like unexplored land and like grow highways, and it's just like launch self-contained artificial farms to Mars and have robots tend them so that when people land there, there's like fresh zucchini.
Yeah, that's fascinating. The it's if I had to boil down like a lot of the when I talk to Jose and some of our other sort of peers interested in these topics, but like if I had to boil down some of their advice or with their suggested recommendations, like more broadly, is what they want to see is like more decentralization in terms of how things are funded in terms of capital sources and how money is distributed, and then also just more like no strings attached funding, just
Mm-hmm.
find awesome people and let them experiment and tinker as opposed to put a lot of boxes around it. Is that a fair summary of some of the biggest things that might move the needle in terms of how funding works?
I think so. I think what I would my reframing of that is like we need more uncorrelated experiments, and so like that sort of gets at the decentralization piece. I think so it's like I definitely agree that like no strings attached funding would be great. I don't quite agree with that as a recommendation because I don't think that it will happen, and I like recommendations to be a little bit more pragmatic. So I might say like sort of like new ways of like organizing those strings would be my riff on that.
Uh, One of the things we talk a lot about is funding, and it seems like there's an increased opportunity for philanthropists here. We're actually at On Deck going to be starting a philanthropist sort of programming
Nice.
soon. And so, what is sort of the call out for like how do philanthropists? What's their role? How should they be thinking about things differently? And yeah, how are you thinking about that sort of leg of the stool, so to speak, as part of the ecosystem?
Yeah. I think a lot of the suggestions that I have are a little bit unpalatable to many philanthropists. And I very much understand that. And so what I'm actually working on is like trying to figure out like how to create more like sort of like almost like create like a third direction so there's not this tension, because a lot of the suggestions involve like more trust, more delegation. I think the biggest piece is that it's almost less when you're starting up a new institution, it's less about the money at the moment and more about the being able to know that there will be money in the future. So what you see very often is that philanthropists are pretty on board with like funding about like small experiments, but then there's there's no agreement around like what success for that experiment looks like, and like the fact that there will be like follow-on funding uh, if you are successful. And so you just and so there's like this tension there. And then I think another thing that philanthropists can really do that I realize is deeply uncomfortable is like help these experiments like reputationally bootstrap. So there's like especially for people who have a lot of money, it's like really uncomfortable to have your name associated with something that might fail, or might that you don't have like a lot of control over. But at the same time, it's like many of these experiments sort of like never get off the ground, and can't raise more money because they can't associate, they can't reputationally bootstrap off of the people who are funding them. And then I think the last piece is just like, I think that it's there's this hesitancy to fund something that doesn't have a path towards sustainability. And right now, one of the only models we have, like the sort of like really like concrete hypotheses that you can have that is sustainable, is being profitable. But then if you're doing something that's not profitable, you can't make an argument for sustainability. And that makes people not want to fund it because they're like reasonably, they're like, well, I don't want to fund this thing that's just going to like need to like leech off of me forever. So we like need to find some new way of creating sustainable organizations that aren't necessarily sustained by selling a product that makes a profit. And something that I just want to double click on is this. I think that we get a little bit it's easy to say like the problem is funding, but I see, especially in the context of PARPA, I see funding as like one piece of a larger like coordination mechanism, right? So like money is a very good way to get people to coordinate, and at the end of the day, it's a coordination problem, and like the way that, and money plays a large role in it, but it's like not simply a matter of just like giving money to the right people, I would argue.
Yeah. And how do you think we can get better at giving money to the right people?
Ooh, that is a good question. I think like I think that the trick is like, one is I think that is the question. I think like one is like better ways of like building trust, and I don't, and that's like very fuzzy, and I don't quite know how to do that. I like ideally it would be here's another tension or just around like philanthropists, is that like they also tend to be people who have who are very, very busy people, with a lot of demands both on their time and their attention and their money. And so there's this tension where like you have like 5 minutes to convince someone that you're trustworthy and that you have a good idea, which is going to select for people who are really good at pitching, rather than maybe the people who are going to be best at executing. And so like if there's, and so perhaps a better, like one way to get better at finding the right people is to like more explicitly delegate trust. So like really start figuring out like, okay, like who do you trust on what axes, and like, and then like really sort of like going all in on that. And the model that I love is like actually from Vannevar Bush's memoirs, where like FDR basically just said to Bush, he's like, okay, like if you tell me that this scientist should be in charge of a thing, we're just going to put him in charge of the thing, right? So there's like complete delegation on the science front to Bush. And then Bush in turn had like a couple of lieutenants that he completely delegated his trust to. And so if like those people came to him, like he would like literally just spend like 5 minutes looking at the proposal and just say like, well, I trust you that like I'm not going to second guess you. And so I feel like there's like a lot of second guessing that goes on, and I'm not quite sure why. But if we can somehow get to a system where we delegate trust more effectively, I think that would be really important.
That's a good place to wrap. Ben, for those interested, where can you point them to?
So I would just point them to the write-up about PARPA. It's very long. You don't have to read all the pieces. And there's a short 2-pager that goes along with it. And the URL for that is just PARPA, like private ARPA, .tech. And yeah, that's probably the best place to learn about that. Feel free to reach out to me via email or Twitter, and hopefully I'll have more updates soon.
Awesome. Ben, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a great episode.
Erik, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you.
check us out at villageglobal.vc.